The Cats of Pere LaChaise by Neil Olonoff, narrated by Otis Jiry. Bateman hated to be late. He was irritated, after wasting half the morning trying to convince his wife to come to Oscar's funeral. Now, ascending to the entrance of the Pere LaChaise crematorium, he was further annoyed at having to weave his way among a group of large cats sunning themselves on the broad steps. Near the top, tired of watching his feet, he carelessly trod on a tail. The yowl was quite loud enough, he thought with amusement, to wake the dead. But the cats did not scatter with alarm. Instead, they arched their backs and glared at him with malevolence. With a nervous backward glance at the cats, Bateman passed into the cool gloom of the crematorium. He delayed a moment in the doorway of the crematorium chamber. Pierre was seated among the small clot of mourners who faced the door of the funerary oven. It reminded Bateman of the time he peered into the courtroom during Pierre and Alicia's divorce 12 years before. Now he hesitated, preparing an explanation for Alicia's absence. Damn her stubbornness. The children, they were a good excuse, of course, or perhaps she could have a cold. Yeah, a cold, he decided. Let him mention the children first. Perhaps he could avoid Pierre's reproachful glances, which always made him feel so guilty. The furnace door was rising to reveal the red glow within. With a whine of automatic machinery, the plain pine coffin slid inwards. Bateman seated himself behind Pierre and his sister. The door descended. That was it. As the group rose with a collective sigh, Pierre turned and saw Bateman. He noticed Pierre's disappointment in not seeing Alicia by his side. Bateman said, "We're really very sorry, Pierre." Pierre answered almost rudely with a perfunctory nod and told his sister to go along home, that he would wait to receive the ashes alone. The group left, and the two men stepped out of the crematorium and strolled across the broad paved plaza. Oscar, the deceased, had been Pierre's brother-in-law. He had died of drink, one might say, but in a most macabre way. Oscar drowned after passing out cold under the Pont Neuf during a rainstorm. The river simply rose around him. The police found him there with no carte d'identité. They took the fingerprints, but Oscar was born in Toulouse, and before they reached the family, the body had bound over to the public crematorium at Pere LaChaise, the famous cemetery in the 20th arrondissement. It was simpler to go ahead with the pauper's funeral. "We were lucky they did him alone," Pierre said to Bateman. "They usually cremate indigents 4 at a time." Bateman looked up in surprise, but said nothing. They scuffed along one of the gravel paths of the cemetery, blinking at puddles of light stippled on the ground. It was a lovely late afternoon, and the leaves of the ancient trees rustled above their heads. "How is she feeling?" asked Pierre, meaning Alicia. "She's fine," said Bateman, reflecting that he was no more certain of her feelings than Alan Kardix, the long-dead spirit medium whose granite tomb they were passing. "And Janine?" asked Pierre. "She's fine, too," said Bateman. Janine was Pierre's daughter. She had just been a baby when Alicia divorced him. Pierre was a morose, silent man by nature, but today he seemed to be groping for a way to prolong the conversation. Bateman felt sorry for him, knowing Pierre found it difficult to overcome his shyness and self-restriction. But Bateman wasn't feeling his usual voluble self either. Their path was crossed then by one of the enormous cats which resided in the cemetery. They seemed to be everywhere, peeking at one from behind tombstones, skulking in the musty vaults. They were huge, and Bateman supposed they made their diet on field mice and other rodents. Pierre said, "Look at the cats, they're so large." Bateman smiled. He felt he could predict each thing Pierre said. The man's mind was that of an engineer, he thought, strictly oriented to the concrete and the real. Bateman could look ahead and pick the most remarkable features of the cemetery's paths. As they passed, Pierre was sure to remark on each. Bateman was amused at this confirmation, not for the first time, of the difference in their characters. Bateman had always been able to ignore the obvious, to act as though the real conditions of life and requirements of propriety simply did not exist. Alicia was like that, too. When their affair had begun in a small gallery on the Rue du Bac, the rest of the world had seemed to fade into the background. Her marriage to Pierre, their child, and Pierre's position in her father's brick and tile factory were all secondary to the paramount fact in their lives, their love for one another. Bateman had been on a buying trip, adding to the art collection of a man who owned several department stores in New York City. For many months, he and Alicia burned up the telephone lines between Paris and New York. He used up his savings on airfares. Finally, Bateman convinced the wealthy New Yorker to station him permanently in Paris. A few years later, Bateman opened his own gallery. But the period before the divorce was painful for all of them. Pierre stayed with Alicia all that time for Janine's sake, preparing baby bottles and coping with early morning colic. Alicia pursued her blossoming career as an artist and her American lover, and somehow between the two found time for her baby. Bateman imagined that Pierre had preferred to have them near him, even without Alicia's love, than to have neither. Afterwards, Pierre never found another woman who suited him. It was an act of sacrifice of which Bateman would not have been capable. Because of it, Janine grew up a happy child. During that year, Bateman and Alicia shocked their friends and family by carrying on an open affair. She often brought Janine around to his apartment or the galleries, but often as not would leave the infant with their father. When Bateman would call her from New York, it was inevitable that Pierre would sometimes answer. Bateman hung up the first few times that happened, but as they became somewhat inured to the situation, he began asking for and leaving messages. Pierre bore it all with not a single word of protest to Bateman. Bateman looked at Pierre, reflecting that it was probably that same repressed, unimaginative quality which had allowed him to survive that trying period, to say nothing of the last 12 lonely years. He saw the tail of a cat disappear behind a tree. "I wonder what the cats eat," he asked. "You suppose someone feeds them?" Pierre laughed in that muffled way of his, a kind of tight-lipped bobbing of the head from which no sound of mirth came out. His eyes kept their eternal sad expression, but there was, for once, a twinkle of animation. He said, "I was talking to one of the men who work in the crematorium before you came. I asked how things were with the ovens and so on." "What do you mean?" Bateman asked. "Delay did an overhaul on the brick linings," said Pierre. Delay was Alicia's maiden name and the name of her father's company, which Pierre still worked. "Oh, I see. The bricks must be replaced every 4 years or so. It wasn't a very big job." "My God, look at the size of that cat," Bateman said. "He must weigh a good 10 kilos. Pierre looked at the tabby cat. "He's a big one, all right," he said. "The fellow told me a funny story about the cats. I don't know whether or not to believe it." "What was that?" The tabby cat was gazing at Bateman with that manic expression they acquire when they're hungry. "The ovens have gas burners," said Pierre. "They reach 1200 degrees, but gas is so expensive these days that they try to economize by reducing the time between cremations so the ovens don't have a chance to cool down." "Well, that makes sense." "Yes, except it means that they must remove the previous corpse sooner. Often, with a large body, especially one that has been frozen, the bones aren't completely reduced to ashes." "You're joking," Bateman said. "What do they do then?" "Well, generally they break the bones with a raclette." "A raclette? Like the bakers use?" "More or less, but that's not the worst of it. The skull and brain are a bigger problem." "The brain?" "Oh, yes. You can imagine. It's enclosed and surrounded by fluid. It's very difficult to burn. And in summer, the bodies must be kept frozen. It takes much longer to burn a frozen corpse." I do see what you mean, said Bateman, a vague nausea beginning in his chest. At any rate, the fellow was saying— Pierre fell silent as they rounded the corner. They had come to a section of the graves covered by graffiti, much of it obscene. I want to fuck you, Jim. The Snake. Patrick, Harley-Davidson, 1984. And finally, sprayed in Dayglow colors across an unmarked granite slab, the explanation. Jim Morrison. The Doors. They stood staring at the hundreds of chalked, painted, and scratched inscriptions. Some had been there for years, but others seemed quite fresh. It was appalling to Bateman. They seemed mindless. He was ashamed of his own country, even after all that time away. There was a small group of bicyclists relaxing at this curve in the path. The bicycle was a nice way to see the cemetery. The paths were smooth and free of traffic, but no one could wander among the stones. They had left their bikes locked together and gone off a little way among the weed-strewn graves. Bateman and Pierre could hear their laughter as they examined the old-fashioned inscriptions. The bicyclists came forward toward them, speaking English, 2 boys and 2 girls walking straight across the graves, without regard for the path between. Bateman looked away. The sun went behind a cloud, and he thought to look at his watch. 5:30 already? It was getting late. He walked a little way down the path, not wanting to see the desecrations performed here to commemorate an American rock star. Pierre remained at the spot, reading the names and comments. A few minutes later, Bateman looked back to see Pierre kneeling by the bicycles, talking to one of the boys, no doubt about the machines. Bateman could see the plaza of the crematorium, and across from it the columbarium, where the urns of ashes were installed. His eyes were caught by a strange scene. In the middle of the plaza, a large German shepherd dog stood motionless. Even at a distance, he could see the bared fangs and the tail lowered between the dog's legs. Surrounding the dog were about a dozen large cats. One of them advanced on the dog, and the ring of cats contracted toward him. The closest cats swatted at the dog, and it appeared they were on the point of attacking him en masse when a man came out of the crematorium and brandished a long stick at the crouching cats. They backed off and watched the man pull the dog away. There were sounds of laughter and some sort of a tussle among the boys and girls at the bend in the path. He wasn't paying much attention. Pierre was still back there. Bateman knew that the sepulchre which held the ashes of Victor Hugo was somewhere in this area. A little further down he could find Rothschild and Gertrude Stein. The sepulchres were quaint. Some were furnished with a sort of low chair with a padded backrest, designed for kneeling in prayer, called a prie-dieu. A few had hooks on the walls for hanging wreaths. Though most of the vaults were securely locked, many were open, and he peered into the shadows of one which had been used as a shelter by generations of winos, to judge from the amount of green bottle glass on the floor. Curled on the faded seat of the ancient prie-dieu was a large gray cat with yellow eyes. Was it his imagination, or was that cat staring at him with a particularly feral look? He had never been fond of cats. When they opened their mouths, showing the tips of their tongues, their eyes glazed over in some humanly unimaginable feline ecstasy, he found them positively loathsome. He wanted to be out of that place. He looked at his watch again. Nearly 6. He really had to be going. He turned around to call to Pierre and found himself staring into his face. He covered his shock with a nervous laugh. "Oh, so there you are," Bateman said. "I thought you had bicycled off with them." "No," said Pierre, frowning. "I really must be getting along," Bateman said. "I told my wife we'd go out to dinner tonight." For the moment he had forgotten to whom he was speaking, but it was too late to recover gracefully. "Of course, I mean Alicia," he said. "Of course," said Pierre. "Myself as well. I've some work to do." "Look, Pierre," said Bateman, "I'm sorry." "For what?" asked Pierre, his eyes flaring suddenly. He was angry, Bateman realized. Bateman was quite taken aback. It was the first time he had seen Pierre show his temper. Pierre had something, a bit of metal in his hand, and he was worrying at it with his fingers. In tense silence, they walked a shortcut between the rows of decrepit graves and thick foliage. The shadows were lengthening, and Bateman felt uncomfortable walking ahead of Pierre. There was a tingling at his scalp. Was he afraid that Pierre might, after all these years, take some sort of physical revenge? He had never uttered a word against Bateman, never hung up a telephone, never left a message go untransmitted. As cuckolds went, Bateman thought he had been as cooperative as could be imagined. Bateman regretted his thought immediately. Pierre was 10 times more generous than he was. He deserved his sympathy, his help, not derision. "You were telling me something before," said Bateman, turning around. Pierre was walking, his eyes downcast, his hands clasped behind, and Bateman was even more regretful of his unspoken mockery. Pierre looked up slowly. It seemed Bateman had disturbed an interior monologue. "Yes," he said, "but I don't believe it myself. Still, I suppose it would be interesting to know the truth." "I'm not following you," said Bateman. "The cats," he said. "You asked how they'd gotten so fat. You would expect them to be starving, and there are so many." "Yes." "Still, I expect you're right," he said. "Someone else probably feeds them, though the man in the crematorium seemed serious." "Pierre," he said, "you're talking in circles. I wish you'd come out and say what you mean." "The way that you do?" asked Pierre. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Never mind. Come on. Maybe I can show you where the cats eat." They had come via the back way to the columbarium. It was nothing more than a wall of niches in which the urns were placed. A plaque engraved with the name and dates was fixed in each place. Some were empty and were marked reserve. They strode across the broad courtyard fronting the crematorium, the massive building now backlit by the reddening sunlight. They left the plaza and continued toward the exit through an older section of graves, terraced to several levels. This was now a low-rent district, with many more abandoned graves and fewer splendid, well-kept ones. "He said he put it somewhere around here," said Pierre, scaling an incline to reach a higher level. They were among the large trees which blocked the sun. Twice, Bateman stumbled on creepers as he tried to trace Pierre's footsteps. "Incredible," he heard Pierre say. "The guy was telling the truth." Bateman emerged into an overgrown area nearly hidden from the main grounds. There was a small cluster of ancient family sepulchres with doors of rusty iron grillwork. Pierre was kneeling on the worn cushion of the prayer stool in one of the vaults, examining the contents of a small dish. He gingerly backed out of the small stone structure. "Take a look," he said. "Watch out, there's cat shit all over it." "I don't wonder," said Bateman. "Look over there." There were no fewer than 25 large cats congregated around the doorway of another sepulchre. He shuddered and peered into the gloom of the vault, trying to make out what was in the small ceramic dish. He had no desire to dirty his hands on that floor. "You won't be able to see it from here," said Pierre. "It's too dark in there." Bateman stooped into the confined darkness. There was a withered wreath and plastic cross suspended from hooks on his right. He had to kneel on the prie-dieu to get a good look at what was in the dish. He recognized it immediately. Nothing looks quite like brain tissue with its twisting convolutions. But he had never seen a brain this large before, and it had already been partially consumed by the cats, he assumed. He was violently startled by a spider crawling across his hand. He crushed it against the stone wall with the back of his hand. There was a gentle thump and the rustling of leaves above him as something landed on the roof. A large cat, no doubt. Someone blew a whistle. It was closing time. He started to rise from the prie-dieu and heard a loud creak. He felt the tomb door close against his shoe soles. That was no accident. There was a loud metallic click. He turned around, difficult, in the confined space. He looked down at the door latch and saw the glint of a sturdy combination lock, the kind used with bicycle chains. It had to be Pierre, but he could see no one. He shouted, "Open it up, Pierre!" There was no reply. He was sure Pierre was still nearby. He remembered him kneeling with the boys at Jim Morrison's grave. After they had gone, he had a bit of shiny metal in his hand. "Mercandagno," he heard, along with the muted thuds of several pairs of padded paws. The huge face of a cat appeared in the window grating opposite the locked door, its insane eyes glowing gold in the dying light. He threw all of his 200 pounds against the iron grating. It looked as though it would shatter with one lunge, but did not. Again, he heaved into it with his shoulder. It was no use. He couldn't back up enough to get momentum. The cat in the window jumped down beside him. The faces of two others appeared in its place. The huge cat on the floor took a swat at his ankle, cocking his head as though curious to see his reaction. He felt a sharp pain and kicked out at the cat. It arched its back and hissed, sounding very loud in the tiny space. What if they all attacked him at once, as they had been about to do in the plaza? He wouldn't be able to hold them off in the claustrophobic space. He could barely move his arms and legs. "Pierre!" he screamed. "For God's sakes!" There were several loud thuds. 3 cats were suddenly on the floor with him. Another, a huge black one, was in the window. It leapt at him. He felt the stab of claws in the back of his neck, and a forepaw raked his right eye. With all his strength, ignoring the claws, sharp as needles, he wrenched the animal off and hurled it against the wall while kicking out at the others, which had begun to attack his legs. "Help, anyone!" he screamed. Then he saw Pierre a few meters away from the grating, wearing on his face his mournful expression which he almost never changed. Bateman was quite hysterical. "They're attacking me!" he shouted. "Please open this thing!" "They're only cats," Pierre said. "Besides, I don't know the combination." There was the beginning of a smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes remained pitying. One of the cats nipped Bateman's ankle, and he winced in pain. Pierre turned and started down the path toward the exit. "For heaven's sakes!" Bateman screamed. "Think of Alicia!" Pierre's steps slowed. He appeared to be reconsidering. Bateman gripped the rusty bars of his cage, watching Pierre disappear from sight, and he heard, "Don't worry, Bateman. I'll tell her you'll be late for dinner."